The doctor stared at the glowing screen, his brows knitting together as the ultrasound revealed something that made his heart pound in alarm. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the probe, his eyes darting back and forth between the monitor and the young woman lying on the bed. A moment later, he removed his gloves, took a deep breath, and turned to the tall man waiting nervously at the corner of the room. His words were like a blade cutting through the sterile air. "You must divorce her. If you want to save yourself and everything you own, end this marriage immediately." Alexander Grant froze, the sound of the word divorce ringing in his ears as if the doctor had shouted it through a megaphone. For a moment he thought he had misheard. Divorce. Why would a doctor say such a thing after looking at an ultrasound that was supposed to bring joy? His chest tightened as Isabella, his wife, sat up quickly on the bed, her face pale and confused. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The silence in the room was heavier than stone. This was not the story of an ordinary couple. This was the story of a man who commanded power over thousands of employees who lived in a mansion filled with chandeliers, rare paintings, and rooms so vast that footsteps echoed for minutes. Alexander Grant was one of the youngest technology millionaires in America, a man who had been celebrated on the covers of magazines and praised for his sharp intellect and relentless ambition. But none of that mattered in this moment. All the money, all the fame, all the influence in the world meant nothing if the foundation of his marriage was poisoned. My dear family, every story I share with you is born from sleepless nights, from the passion of my heart, from the promise that love, betrayal, and healing are lessons that belong to all of us. Stay with me until the end, because only then will you see the truth hidden behind every tear and every decision. The twists you will witness are not just surprises. They are storms that tear apart a soul only to reveal what truly matters when everything else is stripped away. Comment present if you are here with me. Comment I am with this story if your heart is loyal. To my new listeners, if you ever doubt, ask those who have walked with me from the beginning. They will tell you that every tale I bring is not just entertainment. It is a gift, a bond, a mirror of the struggles we all face in different forms. Money can build empires, but it cannot buy love. Wealth can silence rivals, but it cannot silence suspicion. Power can conquer nations, but it cannot conquer loneliness. And Alexander Grant was about to discover that despite his millions, despite his empire, he was perhaps the poorest man alive. The ultrasound should have been a miracle. For months, Alexander and Isabella had prayed for this moment. Their marriage had been shadowed by whispered doubts, by pressure from the family name, and by a deadline set in his father's cruel will. Before his 40th birthday, he needed an heir, or else every dollar of the Grant empire would be dissolved into charities. Now, with Isabella expecting, it should have been the end of fear and the beginning of hope. But with a single sentence from the doctor, the dream shattered like glass, dropped from the chandelier above their heads. Alexander felt as if the walls of the clinic were closing in on him. He looked at Isabella, who clutched her stomach protectively, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and hurt. He wanted to believe in her, to trust the woman he had chosen above all others. Yet the authority of the doctor's voice dug deep into his mind like a hook. What was hidden in that ultrasound? What secret was the doctor trying to warn him about? Stay with me. My family for this story is not about riches or scandal alone. It is about the moment a man must choose between trust and fear, between the love of his heart and the voices that whisper betrayal. And it all began with a doctor's chilling words, "Divorce her." Alexander Grant's mansion stood like a fortress on the hilltop, its iron gates opening only for those who carried the weight of influence or the privilege of wealth. Inside, the air smelled of polished mahogany and expensive cigars, a testament to generations of Grants who had ruled their empire with ruthless precision. Alexander, at 38, sat in the grand library that stretched 2 stories high, filled with leather-bound books he rarely had time to read. His mind was not on his empire tonight, but on the echo of the doctor's words, "Divorce her." The phrase clawed at him like a shadow he could not shake. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling like liquid fire, but even that burn could not numb the turmoil inside him. Isabella had been the light in his otherwise calculating world. She was 29, born to a modest family in Boston, raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked nights at a shipping yard. She had grown up believing in simple joys, in laughter around a kitchen table, in long walks by the river. When Alexander met her at a charity auction 3 years ago, he had been captivated by her honesty, her warmth, her ability to look past the surface of his wealth and see the man within. Against the protests of his stepmother, Madeline, and the mockery of his half-brother Victor, he married her. Their wedding had been a grand affair with hundreds of guests and flashing cameras. Yet for Isabella, the most important part had been when Alexander leaned down and whispered, "We will build our own family." That promise had been the anchor of their marriage through storms of pressure. But now that promise felt like sand slipping through his hands. Upstairs in their bedroom, Isabella rested her hand on her stomach, whispering a prayer into the silence. She had seen the look on the doctor's face, had felt the shift in Alexander's posture, the cold dread that had entered the room when those words were spoken. Her heart ached not just for herself, but for the life growing within her. She wanted to believe her husband's love was strong enough to withstand suspicion, but she knew the Grant family. They were not forgiving. They were not gentle. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's words when she first married Alexander. Wealth can be a palace, or it can be a prison. Downstairs, the golden clock on the mantelpiece ticked mercilessly toward Alexander's 40th birthday, just 22 months away. The will of his father, Edward Grant, hung over him like a guillotine. Produce an heir before 40, or lose everything. The empire, the properties, the fortune that spanned continents would vanish into charities. His father had been clear, believing it was the only way to ensure the Grant name continued through blood. Madeline had been quick to remind Alexander of that ultimatum whenever she saw him without a child at his side. She was 45, elegant with her surgically perfected beauty, and sharp enough to twist every weakness to her advantage. She had once been a secretary in Edward's office, but now she sat like a queen in the mansion, pulling strings with invisible hands. Victor, her son from her first marriage, was 32, clever, charming, and arrogant. He had grown up in the same mansion as Alexander, but never forgot that he was not truly a Grant by blood. Still, he believed he deserved the fortune, and Madeline nurtured that belief like a flame. To them, Isabella was an obstacle. To Alexander, she was supposed to be salvation. And now, because of one doctor's words, she had become the center of suspicion. At dinner that night, the long table stretched between them like an ocean. Isabella offered him a small smile, her eyes filled with questions she dared not ask. Alexander forced himself to meet her gaze, but he could not shake the echo of Harold Bennett's voice in his ears. Divorce her. The chandelier above flickered, casting shadows on the polished surface of the table, as if even the house itself held its breath. Alexander lifted his glass, but found no comfort in its weight. He loved her. God, he loved her. But in a family where bloodlines were weapons and inheritance was war, could love survive? The poison of doubt. Madeline Grant entered the dining room with the slow grace of a predator, her crimson gown flowing behind her like a trail of warning fire. She took her seat at the far end of the table, opposite Alexander and Isabella, her perfectly arched brows lifting as if she had walked into a theater, already knowing the ending of the play. Victor trailed behind her, his smile careless, his movements lazy, yet his eyes carried the sharp gleam of calculation. He leaned against the back of his chair before sliding into it, glancing at Isabella with a smirk that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. The room, with its gilded mirrors and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, seemed colder than ever. Madeline lifted her glass of wine and swirled it slowly. 3 years of marriage and still no child, she remarked, her tone soft, but the sting unmistakable. How fortunate that now at last Isabella has news. A small miracle just in time. The words dripped with honeyed venom. Alexander's jaw tightened his hand, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Isabella's cheeks flushed, but she held her head high, refusing to bow to the older woman's provocation. "We are grateful," she said evenly. "This child is a blessing." Victor chuckled under his breath. Blessings can sometimes feel suspicious when they arrive at such convenient moments, don't you think, brother? His gaze lingered on Alexander, waiting for a reaction. Alexander's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to defend Isabella, to silence them, but the voice of the doctor gnawed at his resolve. Madeline set down her glass, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a hunter cornering prey. "Edward's will is very clear," she said. "The empire must be passed through blood, and blood alone. It would be a tragedy if questions were raised about the purity of that blood." Her words were a dagger wrapped in silk. Isabella drew a sharp breath, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "I will not sit here and listen to my child's existence questioned like this," she whispered, her voice trembling yet steady with conviction. Victor leaned back, folding his arms. "Do not take offense, Isabella. We are only concerned for the legacy of the Grant name. After all, the world is watching, investors, partners, politicians. If there is even a whisper of scandal, the empire could crumble." Alexander slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the cavernous room. Enough. His voice was rough, filled with a fury he could barely control. But Madeline only smiled unbothered, as if she had achieved her purpose. She rose gracefully, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. "Sleep well, Alexander. Tomorrow the world will still expect answers." Victor followed her, his laughter lingering like a poisonous perfume. Isabella turned to her husband, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why do they hate me so much?" she whispered. "What have I done except love you?" Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his trembling grasp. He wanted to promise her the world, to vow that nothing would shake his faith in her. But in his mind, the doctor's warning thundered louder than his own heartbeat. He squeezed her hand but said nothing, the silence cutting deeper than any spoken doubt. Upstairs in the dim corridor, lined with portraits of past Grants, Madeleine and Victor exchanged a glance. Their whispers floated through the silence like serpents. "He is breaking already," Madeleine murmured. "The seed of suspicion has been planted. Now we wait for it to consume him." Victor's grin widened, and when it does, Isabella will be cast out, and the empire will finally be ours. Edward Grant sat in his study, surrounded by towering shelves of legal documents and old family records, his frail frame hunched beneath the weight of oxygen tubes that hissed with every breath. The patriarch of the Grant dynasty was 72, his once commanding presence reduced by illness, yet his eyes still burned with the fire of authority. Alexander stood before him, feeling like a schoolboy again, under the scrutiny of those piercing eyes. Edward's voice rasped through the room. "You know the terms of my will. Before you turn 40, you must have a child, or the empire I built will dissolve into charity. I will not allow outsiders or opportunists to inherit what generations of Grants bled for." Alexander clenched his fists, his heart aching with the burden of responsibility. "Father, Isabella is pregnant. This is our chance." Edward coughed violently, gripping the arm of his chair. "A chance, yes, but are you certain of its legitimacy?" His gaze flicked briefly toward the door where Madeleine hovered like a shadow, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder with false tenderness. Alexander's chest tightened. He knew she had been whispering in Edward's ear, feeding him doubts, but hearing the suspicion spilled directly from his father was like a blade through his ribs. "Isabella loves me," he said firmly. "She would never betray me." Edward shook his head slowly. "Love is fragile, son. Legacy is eternal. I will not see the Grant name destroyed by carelessness." Madeleine's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, as if savoring the fruits of her poison. She leaned down, speaking softly, as though her words were for Edward alone, though Alexander heard every syllable. "The timing is interesting. You were abroad when conception would have taken place. Were you not Victor entered, then carrying a stack of reports, his expression solemn yet tinged with satisfaction. "Investors are already restless, father. Rumors travel fast. If there is uncertainty about the heir, the company could lose billions overnight." Edward's eyes hardened, the veins on his hand bulging as he gripped the armrest. "Do you hear that, Alexander? Even the markets know that blood must be unquestionable. Isabella's child must be proved without doubt. Otherwise, I will take measures myself." Alexander's heart pounded. He wanted to shout to defend his wife, but the memory of the doctor's grave expression replayed in his mind. "Divorce her." The words followed him like a ghost, making his tongue heavy with fear. "Father, give me time," he pleaded. Edward closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but steady. "Time is a luxury we do not have. Every day brings me closer to the end. You must act, Alexander. You must ensure the child is truly yours." Madeleine placed a hand against Edward's chest as if to calm him, but her eyes locked with Alexander's, gleaming with triumph. Victor set the reports on the desk with a finality that echoed like a verdict. "The empire is at stake, brother. One false move and it all disappears." The room closed in around Alexander, the tick of the antique clock, like the drum of a death march. He felt trapped, torn between the love of his wife and the crushing weight of expectation, between the warmth of Isabella's smile and the icy grip of his family's suspicions. As he left the study, his father's words rang in his ears. Legacy is eternal. Love is fragile. The mansion's corridors stretched endlessly before him. Portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to demand loyalty to blood above all else. Alexander paused halfway down the hallway, pressing a hand against his chest where his heart thudded painfully. He whispered into the silence as if confessing to ghosts. What if they are right? What if I lose everything for believing in her? The silence gave no answer, only the faint echo of Madeline's laughter drifting from the study, a reminder that the war for the Grant Empire had already begun, and his marriage was the battlefield. The following week brought both joy and unease, as Isabella's pregnancy was confirmed beyond doubt. The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of the Grant mansion, and for a moment it felt as though light itself had chosen to bless the household. Isabella stood in the garden, her hands gently cradling her stomach, her dark hair catching the breeze. She whispered to the life growing inside her, promising protection, love, and a future untouched by the coldness of the mansion's walls. Alexander watched her from the balcony, his chest tightening with emotions he could not name. This was supposed to be their miracle, the answer to his father's cruel ultimatum, the hope that would finally silence the whispers of doubt. Yet instead of peace, the pregnancy had drawn even sharper blades of suspicion. At dinner that evening, the family gathered once again under the glittering chandelier. The air was heavy with tension, disguised as civility. Isabella spoke softly about her plans for the nursery, her eyes glowing with excitement, but her words fell into a silence thick enough to suffocate. Madeline stirred her soup slowly, her gaze fixed on Isabella with the precision of a hawk. "How fortunate," she said at last, her voice dripping with feigned warmth. "After years of trying, the miracle comes just as Edward's deadline approaches. What remarkable timing." Victor's smirk widened as he leaned closer to Alexander. "Almost too remarkable, don't you think, brother?" The suggestion slid into Alexander's ears like poison. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to slam his fist on the table. Isabella's spoon clattered softly against her plate. As she set it down, her face pale. She looked directly at Alexander, searching for reassurance, but his eyes darted away, haunted by the doctor's warning. Later that night, Isabella found him in the study, staring at the flames in the fireplace, as though they held the answers to every question tormenting him. She approached quietly, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Alexander, talk to me. You have been distant ever since the appointment. Is something wrong with the baby?" He turned to her, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and fear. "No, nothing is wrong, at least not with the baby." Then why she pressed her voice breaking. "Why do you look at me as if I am a stranger?" He reached for her hand, but hesitated, the doubt gnawing at him too sharp to ignore. "Isabella," he whispered, "tell me again. This child, it is mine, isn't it?" The words sliced the air like a sword. Isabella recoiled, tears flooding her eyes. "How can you even ask me that? After everything, after our vows, after our prayers for this child, how dare you question me?" Alexander's heart ached as he watched her crumble, yet he could not silence the echo of the doctor and the venom of his family. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I am under pressure you cannot imagine." She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself, as though shielding not just her body, but the child within. I may not come from wealth, Alexander, but I know love, and love without trust is nothing but chains. Her words lingered in the room long after she had gone, leaving Alexander alone, with the fire and the crushing weight of his doubts. In the shadows of the hallway, Madeleine and Victor exchanged a glance, their lips curling into subtle smiles. The cracks in the marriage were spreading, and soon the entire foundation would collapse. For Alexander, the line between truth and deception was blurring with each passing day. For Isabella, the mansion that was meant to be her home was becoming her prison. And for the unborn child, still only weeks old, the world it was entering was already poisoned by suspicion and betrayal. Dr. Harold Bennett's office smelled of antiseptic and old leather, a place that had always felt safe to Alexander when he was a child. He remembered sitting in the same chair years ago with a scraped knee, listening to the kind doctor's reassuring voice. But today, the warmth was gone. Today, Harold Bennett sat with a folder spread open on his desk, his face lined with something far darker than age. Alexander, the Bethir have gone over the results again and again, he said quietly. There is no mistake. The genetic markers in this pregnancy do not match your own. Alexander's mouth went dry, his fingers tightening on the armrests as if to keep himself from falling out of the chair. That is impossible, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Isabella is my wife. We have tried for years. Harold's eyes were filled with pity. Yet beneath the pity lay something heavier, something Alexander could not quite name. I know this is painful, my boy, but the facts are what they are. The child she carries cannot be yours. He pushed the folder forward, filled with printed reports and charts. Alexander barely understood, but the words typed in bold letters were devastating. Incompatible DNA. Alexander shoved the folder back, shaking his head violently. No, you must be wrong. Labs make mistakes. Machines fail. Harold sighed deeply, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. I thought so too, which is why I sent the samples to 3 separate laboratories: Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic. All of them returned the same result. I wish I could tell you otherwise, Alexander, but science does not lie. Alexander's chest constricted, his pulse racing, until he thought his heart would give out. Every memory of Isabella flashed through his mind, the laughter they had shared, the promises whispered in the dark, the tears they had shed over failed attempts to conceive. Could it all have been a lie? Harold leaned forward, his tone lower, now laced with something almost conspiratorial. My advice as both your physician and as someone who has known this family for decades is that you must act quickly. Divorce her before this becomes public knowledge. Protect yourself, protect the empire, protect the legacy your father built. Divorce her. The word echoed in Alexander's skull like a gunshot. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Isabella would never do this to me. Harold's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Alexander thought he saw something like guilt pass across his face. But then the doctor masked it with professional detachment. I understand this is hard to accept, he said, but think of what is at stake. If this child is allowed to be born into the Grant line, the scandal could destroy everything. Your father's health could not endure the shock. Alexander stumbled from the office, his vision blurred with rage and disbelief. Outside the city bustled with life cars honking and people rushing along sidewalks. Oblivious to the fact that his world had just been torn apart, he stood in the cold air for several minutes, his breath uneven, the folder of damning papers clutched in his hand. How could he face Isabella now? How could he look into her eyes without seeing betrayal? Back at the mansion, Isabella was humming softly in the nursery. She had already begun to prepare painting dreams on the walls with every stroke of her imagination. She looked up eagerly when Alexander entered, but the moment she saw the anguish in his eyes, her heart faltered. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stared at her for a long time, torn between love and suspicion, between trust and fear. "Nothing," he said, finally forcing the lie through his teeth. "Just work." He turned away before she could see the storm in his gaze. Behind him, Isabella touched her stomach protectively, whispering to the child within, "Whatever comes, little one, I will fight for you." Neither of them knew that in another office across town, Harold Bennett was on the phone. His voice hushed. "It is done. He believes it." And on the other end of the line, Madeline Grant's satisfied laughter curled through the air like smoke, sealing the trap that would push Alexander closer to ruin. 3 days passed, and in those days Alexander carried the weight of a man who had aged decades overnight. He sat at the head of the breakfast table with untouched food before him, his coffee cold, his mind drowning in the words of Harold Bennett, "Divorce her." Each time Isabella smiled at him with glowing joy, each time she spoke of baby names or touched her stomach with tender affection. Guilt and rage warred inside him. Was she lying to him every moment, or was he betraying her by doubting? On the 4th morning, Isabella spread strawberry jam on toast and looked across at him with a smile so radiant it nearly broke his heart. "I was thinking," she said, "if it is a boy, we could name him after your father, Edward Grant, Jr. And if it is a girl, perhaps we could call her Margaret, after your grandmother." Alexander's throat tightened, his father the man who would disown him at the slightest hint of scandal, and his grandmother who had once told him that love was worthless without duty. To name the child after them felt like cruel irony. He forced a smile and nodded, but the jam on her toast tasted like ashes in his own mouth. She studied him carefully, her brow furrowed. "You seem distant, Alexander. Is something wrong? Are you unhappy about the baby?" The question pierced him like a knife. Unhappy. He wanted to shout that he was devastated, that the foundations of his soul had been ripped apart, but all he said was, "I am happy, truly." He reached across the table to touch her hand, and though she squeezed his fingers, his skin crawled with a weight of unspoken doubts. Later that day, while Isabella rested, he sat in his office staring at the folder Harold Bennett had given him. Incompatible DNA, 3 laboratories, reports that screamed betrayal. He opened his phone and saw a message from Victor. "We should talk. I know things about Isabella you deserve to hear." His hand shook as he deleted the message, unwilling to give his half-brother the satisfaction. But the seed had been planted deeper. That night, Madeline appeared in the doorway of his study, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway lamps. She entered without asking, her perfume sharp and invasive. "Alexander," she said gently, "you cannot ignore reality. I warned Edward that this marriage would bring disaster, and now look." The timing of her pregnancy, your trip abroad, the whispers in society circles. People already suspect. If you do not act, you will lose everything. He turned on her, his eyes blazing. "She is my wife. She is carrying my child." Madeleine's smile was pitying, as though she were speaking to a child clinging to fairy tales. "Then prove it. Demand a paternity test. If she is innocent, you will have nothing to fear. If she is not, you will save the Grant name." The suggestion tore at him. To demand such a test would be to confess his doubts to Isabella, to destroy the fragile trust between them. Yet to ignore it meant risking his entire legacy. He dismissed Madeleine with a wave of his hand, but her words lingered long after she had gone. That evening, Isabella sat in the nursery, surrounded by swatches of fabric for curtains and blankets. She looked up as Alexander entered, her eyes bright with hope. "Will you help me choose the colors?" she asked, holding up 2 samples. He opened his mouth, but no words came. All he could think about was Harold Bennett's voice, Madeleine's poisoned suggestions, and Victor's smirk. He excused himself quickly, leaving Isabella staring after him, confusion and hurt clouding her face. Alone in the hallway, Alexander pressed his forehead against the wall, his chest heaving. He felt trapped in a labyrinth of lies, unsure which path led to truth and which to destruction. The cruelest torture was not the pain of betrayal, but the need to smile at the woman he loved, while secretly fearing she had already destroyed him. The annual Grant Foundation Gala shimmered with gold and crystal, an event that drew senators, business magnates, and celebrities into the ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel, a place where reputations were forged and destroyed in a single evening. Alexander adjusted his black tie before the mirror, his reflection a stranger staring back at him with hollow eyes. Isabella entered the room moments later, wearing a gown of emerald silk that clung gracefully to her growing figure, her face glowing with a beauty so radiant that for an instant Alexander forgot his torment. She smiled shyly, touching her stomach. "I wanted tonight to be perfect," she whispered. "Our first public appearance since the announcement. Everyone will see that the Grants have a future." Alexander forced a smile, though his chest burned with doubt. "Perfect, yes," he muttered, though the word tasted bitter. Downstairs, photographers waited eagerly, flashes exploding as the couple descended the marble staircase. The crowd erupted in congratulations. Champagne glasses raised, but beneath every toast Alexander heard whispers. How convenient, they murmured, how timely, just before Edward's deadline. The gossip stung sharper than any blade. Isabella's smile trembled, but held firm her hand, clutching his arm with desperate faith. Throughout the evening, dignitaries approached with polite words and veiled questions. Senator Douglas clasped Alexander's hand warmly. "Congratulations, my boy." Edward must be overjoyed. "Just in time too, eh?" His eyes glinted with unspoken curiosity. Alexander nodded stiffly, his grip tightening on the glass he held. Across the room, Madeleine glided like a queen, her sapphire gown glittering under chandeliers as she whispered into eager ears. Victor charmed clusters of young investors, his laughter ringing out as he spread rumors with casual cruelty. And all the while, Isabella tried to hold her head high, presenting herself as the proud wife carrying the future of the dynasty. At one point, she approached Alexander with tears hidden behind her brave smile. "They are all staring at me," she murmured. "I can feel it as though I am on trial." He brushed her cheek lightly. "Ignore them." But even as he said it, he himself could not ignore the weight of suspicion pressing in from every side. Halfway through the evening, Thomas Ellison, a private investigator, hired quietly by Edward weeks earlier, slipped a manila envelope into Alexander's hand. "Sir," he said softly, "you need to see this." Alexander excused himself to the corner of the ballroom, his pulse quickening as he opened the envelope. Photographs spilled out like daggers. Isabella meeting another man outside a medical clinic. Isabella embracing him briefly in the shadow of a parking garage. Isabella speaking with him in hushed tones. The man's face was partly turned, but Alexander recognized him instantly. Marcus Lynn, a former business associate, turned rival, a man of Asian and European heritage, who had once been close enough to dine at their table before betrayal ended their partnership. Alexander's vision blurred the floor tilting beneath him. The whispers, the timing, the doctor's words, it all snapped together like a trap. He staggered back toward the ballroom where Isabella stood, laughing gently with a group of patrons, her hand protectively on her stomach. Rage and heartbreak churned inside him until he felt he might explode. He moved to her side, whispering sharply, "We need to talk, now." She looked startled, but followed him to the east terrace where the night air was cool and the murmur of voices carried faintly from inside. He held up the photographs, his hand shaking. "Explain this." Her eyes widened in shock as she scanned the images. "Alexander, this is not what you think. That man Marcus, he is my cousin. He has been helping me with medical appointments because I was scared to go alone." Alexander's laugh was harsh, broken. "Your cousin. Do you expect me to believe this? The doctor's tests, the timing, and now these photos. Everything points to betrayal." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Look at me," she pleaded, stepping closer. "Do you truly believe I would destroy us like this? Do you think the child I carry is not yours?" Alexander's chest heaved, torn between the love he still felt for her and the avalanche of evidence crushing him. Before he could speak, the ballroom doors opened and Madeline stepped gracefully onto the terrace, Victor close behind. Their voices carried deliberately loud enough for the guests inside to hear. Such a shame, Madeline sighed. To see Alexander humiliated like this, his wife caught in lies. Gasps rippled from the crowd as eyes turned toward the terrace. Phones lifted discreetly, recording the scene. Victor shook his head in mock sympathy. Betrayal is always hardest when it comes from within the family. Alexander felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on him. He looked at Isabella, trembling tears streaming down her face. He wanted to shield her, to silence the whispers, but rage overpowered him. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing into the ballroom. "You have destroyed my trust, Isabella. In front of everyone, you have made me a fool." The crowd gasped louder, the scandal exploding like wildfire. Isabella's sobs broke into the night, her hands clutching her stomach, as if protecting the unborn child from the venom of the moment. Madeline and Victor stood behind Alexander, like shadows triumphant, their plan unfolding perfectly. Cameras flashed glasses, shattered whispers rose to a roar. And as Isabella collapsed into a chair broken by humiliation, Alexander turned his back on her, walking into the blaze of lights and judgment, not realizing he had just set fire to the very foundation of his own soul. 6 months after the gala, the once unshakable Grant Empire was crumbling like a sandcastle against relentless waves. Stock prices had plummeted, investors withdrew, and newspapers across the country had splashed Alexander's humiliation on their front pages. The photographs of Isabella weeping on the terrace, clutching her stomach, as he denounced her in front of 500 witnesses, had become a symbol of scandal. Alexander now sat alone in his penthouse office, 60 floors above the city, staring at the skyline with eyes hollowed by regret. Divorce papers lay signed on his desk beside bottles of untouched whiskey. He had not seen Isabella since that night. She had vanished from the mansion, choosing to live quietly in a modest apartment on the other side of the city. Rumors swirled endlessly. Some said she fled to Marcus Lynn, others that she had returned to her family. None of the whispers mattered to Alexander. What mattered was the silence. His phone no longer lit up with her messages, her laughter no longer echoed in the halls, her touch no longer soothed his nights. And though he tried to bury himself in work, every document he signed was stained by the memory of her tears. Edward's health worsened the weight of betrayal, breaking what disease had already weakened. Madeline hovered at his bedside with false devotion, while Victor circled the boardroom like a vulture. They had won the battle, or so it seemed, yet victory tasted like ashes, for even they knew the empire was dying. One stormy evening, Thomas Ellison appeared at Alexander's office, his face pale with urgency. "Sir, I have completed the investigation you ordered," he said quietly, placing a thick folder on the desk. Alexander barely looked up. "What does it matter now?" "She is gone." The investigator's voice dropped. "It matters because she was innocent." Alexander's head snapped up, his heart hammering. "What did you say?" Ellison opened the folder, spreading photographs, reports, and medical records across the mahogany desk. The images that once condemned Isabella were fabrications. The supposed embraces with Marcus Lynn were angles carefully staged. The genetic results Harold Bennett had presented were falsified, bought with Madeline's money. The truth hit Alexander like a thunderclap. Isabella had never betrayed him. The child was his all along. The room spun the weight of his mistake, crushing him until he could barely breathe. He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking. "What have I done?" Ellison spoke gently. "She gave birth 2 weeks ago. Twins, a boy and a girl. Both carry your genetic markers beyond doubt. Their names are Charles, after your father, and Rose, after your mother." Alexander's tears fell freely, burning his cheeks. Twins, his children, the heirs his father had demanded, the miracle he had prayed for the family he had destroyed with his own hands. He staggered to his feet, gripping the edge of the desk for balance. "Where is she?" Ellison hesitated. "In a small apartment downtown, supporting herself with freelance work. She refused all assistance from the family. She has sworn never to let the Grants near her children." Alexander's knees nearly buckled. He had left her to face the storm. Alone had humiliated her publicly, had abandoned her while carrying his children. And yet, even now, she was raising them with love, honoring his family with their names. That night, Alexander drove through sheets of rain until he reached the humble building Ellison had described. He stood outside the door for a long time, listening to the faint cries of infants within. His hand trembled as he raised it to knock, but when the door opened, Isabella stood there, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and fury. For a long moment, neither spoke. Behind her, 2 bassinets sat in the corner, holding the sleeping forms of the twins. Alexander's breath caught at the sight, his chest aching with unbearable longing. Isabella's voice was cold as ice. "What are you doing here?" He fell to his knees on the threshold, tears streaming down his face. "Forgive me, Isabella. I was blind. I let them poison me against you. I destroyed us." Her lips trembled, but her eyes blazed. "You destroyed more than us, Alexander. You destroyed me. You destroyed the trust that could never be rebuilt. And you humiliated me when I needed you most." He bowed his head, his sobs echoing in the hallway. "I know I do not deserve forgiveness, but I beg you let me be a father to them. Let me protect them, provide for them, love them." Isabella stared at him for a long time, her heart torn between rage and the memory of the man she once loved. Finally, she stepped aside, her voice low and trembling. "You may see them, but only as their father, not as my husband." Alexander entered the small apartment, humbled by its simplicity. He approached the cribs, his hands shaking, as he touched the tiny fingers of his son and daughter. The infants stirred their innocent faces free of the sins of their father. In that moment, Alexander realized that though he had lost his marriage, he had been given a second chance at something far greater, the chance to fight for his children, to prove through actions what his words had destroyed. And as Isabella watched from across the room, her arms folded protectively, she wondered if even shattered love could someday rise again from the ruins. The Grant mansion had grown silent like a mausoleum, its grand halls echoing only with the slow hiss of Edward's oxygen machine. The patriarch lay propped against pillows, his once powerful frame reduced to fragile bones, wrapped in thinning skin. Yet his eyes, though dulled by pain, still carried the sharpness that had built an empire. When Alexander entered the room carrying the weight of guilt, heavier than any fortune, Edward lifted his head weakly. "So you came." He rasped his voice, a faint echo of the command it once carried. Alexander dropped to his knees at his father's bedside, unable to hold back the tears that had haunted him for months. "Father, I have failed you. I believed lies. I destroyed my wife. I abandoned my children." Edward's lips curled into a bitter smile. "So you finally know." "Madeline thought I would not live long enough to see the truth, but even dying men can still open their eyes." He motioned to the nightstand where a thick envelope lay. With trembling fingers, Alexander opened it and found photographs, medical records, and signed statements. Proof. Proof that Harold Bennett had falsified the reports. Proof that Victor and Madeline had orchestrated the conspiracy. Proof that Isabella had been innocent all along. Edward coughed violently, flecks of blood staining the silk sheets. "She never betrayed you, Alexander. She was our salvation." "And we," he broke off, gasping for air, his hand clutching Alexander's, destroyed her instead. Alexander's tears fell freely, staining his father's hands. "Father, why did you doubt her?" Edward's eyes closed briefly, then opened with a glimmer of remorse. "Because I was blinded by fear. I thought only of legacy, of bloodlines of the empire I had built. I forgot that legacy means nothing without love. That was my sin, and you paid for it." Alexander bowed his head, his voice breaking. "I cannot undo what I have done. Isabella will never forgive me." Edward tightened his grip with surprising strength. "Then do not ask her for forgiveness. Earn it. Show her with every breath, every act that you are the man she once believed in. Not for yourself, but for your children, for Charles, for Rose." Alexander froze his head, snapping up. "You know their names." Edward smiled faintly. "I sent someone to see them. They look like you did as a baby, stubborn, strong." And she, his voice faltered with emotion, she named them after us. Even after what we did, she honored this family. That is the kind of woman you destroyed. He coughed again, his body trembling under the strain. Madeline entered, then her face painted with concern, but her eyes narrowed when she saw the envelope scattered across the bed. Edward's voice sharpened, filled with the last fragments of his old strength. "Get out," Madeline faltered. "Edward, you should not upset yourself. I am your wife." Edward's eyes blazed. "You are a viper who slithered into my house and poisoned my blood. I know everything now. The bribes, the lies, the doctor you bought. You destroyed my son's marriage and almost my grandchildren's future. You will inherit nothing." Madeline's face twisted, her mask of elegance cracking. "How dare you? I have given you years of my life. I was the one at your side while your empire grew." Edward's hand slammed against the mattress with surprising force. "You gave me nothing but rot. Leave before I summon the lawyers to throw you out tonight." Madeline recoiled, as if struck, her lips trembling with fury, but she turned sharply and fled the room. Alexander sat stunned, watching his father's final judgment unfold. Edward leaned back, his breathing ragged, his strength nearly gone. "My time is ending," he whispered. "But you still have time, Alexander. Do not waste it chasing what I chased. The empire will crumble without love to bind it. Go to her, fight for her. Show your children that a Grant can rise from ashes." Alexander pressed his father's frail hand to his forehead, weeping silently. Hours later, when Edward breathed his last and the house fell into mourning, Alexander stood in the garden under the weight of both grief and clarity. His father's final words echoed like a command written in stone. "Earn her forgiveness, not with words, but with the life you choose to live." And as thunder rolled in the distance, Alexander swore that he would do just that, even if it took the rest of his life. The funeral of Edward Grant was a spectacle of power and sorrow, attended by politicians, magnates, and society elites. Yet for Alexander, it was nothing more than a reminder of everything he had lost. He stood before the casket, the weight of his father's final words pressing down on him like chains. When the ceremony ended and the mansion emptied of mourners, he did not linger with Madeline or Victor, who sulked like shadows now stripped of power. Instead, he drove through the quiet city streets until he reached the modest neighborhood where Isabella lived with their twins. The building was humble, the lights warm behind thin curtains, and Alexander felt more fear standing at that door than he ever had facing corporate raiders or global leaders. When Isabella opened it, her eyes were wary, her arms cradling Rose, while little Charles toddled nearby with unsteady steps. She said nothing at first, only stared at him as if seeing a ghost. Alexander dropped to his knees, his voice trembling. "I have no right to be here, but I came to beg. Not for myself, for them, for our children." She stiffened, adjusting Rose in her arms protectively. "You humiliated me in front of the world. You believed lies over my love. You left me when I needed you most. How could you ever expect me to trust you again?" He bowed his head, his tears soaking into the worn carpet at her feet. "I expect nothing, Isabella. I only ask for a chance to prove with my life what my words destroyed. Edward is gone. He saw the truth before he died. He told me legacy means nothing without love. And he was right. I have money still, I have influence still, but without you and them, I am the poorest man alive." Isabella's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening, though she tried to hold firm. "Words, Alexander. You always had the right words, but words are not enough." He looked up at her, then his face ravaged by grief and determination. Then I will show you, day by day, deed by deed. I will never leave again, not until you believe. He rose slowly, extending a trembling hand toward Charles, who had stopped and was staring curiously at him. The boy tottered forward, his tiny fingers gripping Alexander's larger hand with trust untainted by history. Alexander's chest shattered with emotion as he whispered, "I am your father, and I will never fail you again." Isabella's lips parted, her heart warring against the fortress of pain she had built. She let him stay that night, not as her husband, not as her partner, but as a guest who was allowed to feed his son a bottle and cradle his daughter to sleep. For weeks that became months, Alexander returned every day. He changed diapers with clumsy hands. He rocked the twins through sleepless nights. He cooked simple meals in the small kitchen, though he had never boiled an egg before. And slowly, the ice around Isabella's heart began to crack, though she guarded it fiercely. One spring afternoon, as the twins played in the grass of the tiny garden behind the apartment, Alexander knelt beside Isabella and whispered, "I know you may never take me back, but if you do, I will spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy." She studied him for a long moment, her heart torn. Then Rose toddled toward them, her first clear word ringing out with innocent joy, "Home." Isabella's tears spilled as she scooped the child into her arms. She looked at Alexander, then truly looked at him, and for the first time in months, saw not the man who betrayed her, but the man who was trying to rebuild himself piece by piece. Slowly she reached for his hand. "Not forgiven, not yet, but we will try." Alexander's heart surged with hope as he pressed her hand to his lips, and in that moment, surrounded by their children, the ashes of the Grant dynasty gave way to the first fragile sparks of a new beginning, a family not built on wealth or legacy, but on love that had been tested, shattered, and still found the strength to rise again.